there's been 15 sessions, and some people have been to side events and satellite events over the 3 days, and there's been an immense range of speakers and input from various people. But I do hope you've all enjoyed it. So this is the final plenary session, which will reflect on some of the key points in learning from the last few days. I've got a great panel here. Angeles Montadas Prim Lafita from Spain and INCO. Cecilia Kinstrand Isaacson from Swedish Match in Sweden. And Konstantinos Varsalinos, who everyone I'm sure will remember from the very brilliant Michael Russell oration he delivered at the beginning of GFN. Now, this is an opportunity not only to, to reflect on what's happened over the last few days, but also to think, reflect on that in terms of the title of this year's conference, Tobacco Harm Reduction, Here for Good. And very clearly that's got two meanings. Clearly, tobacco harm reduction is good for people, good for individuals who would otherwise be smoking. And it also here for good in that it's not going to go away, despite the best wishes of some people who would hope it would all vanish and they wouldn't need to deal with it. Which brings me to, I'm going to borrow a phrase that Thomas Gorman used earlier, that trying to prevent people using safer products is like trying to turn back a wave with an umbrella. But progress can and is being delayed, and we've heard a lot about that, including in the last session. And that's detrimental to very many millions of people. I'm now going to pass across to the panelists and take a seat in this very nice comfy chair, because my legs are a bit tired. I'm sure that's the conference and nothing to do with what's happened after the conference each evening. Each of the panellists are going to provide a little bit of context on where they see things are, and I've asked them to highlight 2 or 3 of the key highlights for them from the conference so far. And then if we've got time at the end, we will come out to the audience. So you may wish to start thinking about what your highlights are. Sorry, Angeles, start you.
Well, hello, my name is, well, you already said my name. Well, I think talking about harm reduction, I'm absolutely sure that harm reduction is here for good and it's here to stay. But we're facing many barriers, and I'd like to have the chance, if I may, to talk a little bit of what's going to be going on in Spain in the coming months, because we got from the Ministry of Finance, they've presented this draft bill in which they want to make vape shops disappear completely. That meaning that if vape shops want to continue operating, they have to transition into tobacconists and being forced to sell combustibles. On the other hand, if, of course, no vape shop is going to go through this transition because they're not going to be selling combustibles. But, for instance, tobacconists might or might not sell vaping products. I mean, it's up to them. Well, this means, I mean, the government wants to monopolize the nicotine market. And this is weird. A country which is a member state of the European market wants to monopolize a free and independent market. That's going back in time to where Spain wasn't even a democracy, or even if we go further back, it's like going to the Spanish Inquisition. So that's horrifying, because not only for consumers, which are going to be forced to go to a tobacconist to get their products, as many as they can find, because it's up to the tobacconist to what they're going to be selling. But it's also like trying to have, it's like forcing an AA meeting to be held in a liquor store. And also, I mean, if we think out of being like thinking as an advocate, it's also going to mean the loss of 1,200 direct jobs and 3,000 indirect jobs, plus all the families that are going to stay without any income. So we're facing that, and right now we're on stage number 3, which means an open public consultation, and all submissions are very welcome, because we really want that as soon as this draft bill becomes a law project and is to be voted on, we really wish, that it doesn't pass. Because if this law passes, all vape shops will only have 6 months to notify the Commission of the tobacco market that they want to transition into a tobacconist, or else we're only going to have the tobacconist, stores to get whatever we find. Result, black markets, disobedience, and lots of people going back to smoking. I just wanted to tell this because I think it was a very good opportunity for me, because tobacco control in Spain, and Konstantinos knows very well, it's one of the fiercest and most stalled in the European Union. They defame the countries that stand for THR. One of the worst things I've heard lately is that coming from official institutions saying, how are we going to trust the UK if they have their car wheels on the right?
Tobacco control movement in Spain, it was shocking to see. I think it was in 2014, their first assault on vaping, that for 1 year they completely destroyed the cigarette market based on the fallacy that glycerol in electronic cigarette liquids causes lipoid pneumonia. Lipoid pneumonia is an inflammation of the lungs caused by lipids, but glycerol is an alcohol, it's not even a lipid. So if you ask a secondary school chemistry student, you don't need any more knowledge on chemistry besides that. Everyone knows that glycerol and anything that ends in ol is an alcohol. So an alcohol cannot cause lipoid pneumonia. We would call it an alcoholic pneumonia, not a lipoid pneumonia. But it worked perfectly in Spain. They destroyed the market. And I wonder, why don't you get a tobacconist license without selling combustibles and selling only e-cigarettes as...
It's mandatory.
Yeah.
You have to sell combustibles, and you have to have...
That's a nice argument.
Yeah.
That the government mandates us to sell cigarettes. Why don't you use that as an argument? It's a very interesting argument that we are obliged, according to the new rule, to sell cigarettes, while we've never sold cigarettes until now. Yeah. That's what you should use.
Of course, online sales will be knocked out because, you cannot sell or buy combustibles online. If a vape shop wants to transition, they're going to have to send combustibles and state stamps.
Yeah, I think you've given us a really good example of just how difficult the situation can be. And it's the second time today the Inquisition's been mentioned, which is interesting and slightly worrying. I'm sure someone in Poland got in a lot of trouble for suggesting something about planets in the orbit with the Inquisition, so I guess it is. But I am going to press you now to maybe reflect on some of the things from the conference that you think some of the most important, or the things...
As usual, GFN is always the place where you feel at home. You feel, yeah, absolutely. It's like where it's inclusive. Everybody comes here. Well, everybody is invited. Not everybody comes, of course. But yes, and it's a place where we, especially after 2 years of pandemic, where I mean, all THR advocates have been totally frustrated. So meeting everybody in person has been very, very gratifying, because it kind of brings up that spirit, like, let's continue the fight, because we're all burned out. But yes, I mean, as I was saying, I think that harm reduction, tobacco harm reduction, is a revolutionary movement held by consumers. So I think it's here for good, and it's here to stay, no matter what happens, no matter what type of legislation, because we're used to disobedience or whatever we need, but we're not going to, I mean, we, for instance, vapors or people that use safer nicotine products that have been using them for a long time, they're not going to go back to smoking. They have many ways of getting their products, but what will happen with those people who still smoke and don't have the chance to get all those products? And
yeah, it's a very, very, very good point. And you've certainly earned the check for the write-up about how much you enjoy GFN. The check will be in the post.
Let me expand on that, because, and I'm going to do my saying with what she said, using the Spanish example, in answering the question if tobacco harm reduction is here to stay. Yes, it is, but Spain and many other cases show the big problem that I also see. For what proportion of the people who need tobacco harm reduction, THR will be there? That's the main problem that we're seeing. Of course, the products will never disappear, but what matters in any harm reduction strategy for whatever, and of course, in this case for smoking, what matters is to avoid inequalities. And inequalities in terms of accessibility to proper, reliable information, accessibility to the tools, so they are reducing accessibility to the products, appeal of these tools. People, smokers should like these products. They try to make them horrible. And of course, smokers will not try anything horrible, and no one is gonna eat, drink anything which smells or tastes horribly. The problem is going to be access to tobacco harm reduction. The example of Spain, and that's the second time such an assault on vaping has happened in Spain. The example of many other countries where they always try to put hurdles in accessibility, they try to increase the cost through taxation, is that a small proportion of the people who need this strategy are going to have access to this strategy, because they make it more expensive, less accessible, less easy to use. They try to limit variability, which is extremely important. Everything is based on self-preference. And I think that this is what we should be discussing, how we will increase access to reliable information, which will translate in knowledge for non-experts. I'm talking about citizens, about smokers. Everyone deserves the truth. Even non-smokers should know the truth. And then end up with access to cheap, reliable, good quality products with the variability needed so that everyone will find whatever they want to use and they like to use.
Thank you. Cecilia, can I...
Yes.
Reflections on GFN.
So it's wonderful to be back. Teams calls are nice, but this is fantastic. Going on to the Spanish issue, I actually met with the Ministry of Health in Spain when I started to work for Swedish Match, because we had this fantastic data around smoking prevalence in Sweden, and we came loaded with a nice presentation, and they were like, interesting, we're not interested. Is tobacco harm reduction here to stay? Yes, because the consumers have rights, and we are right, and I think that's very important to remember, that we're actually on the good side here. but it's going to be a bumpy ride. I'm based in Brussels. I work a lot with EU legislation, and I think we all should be aware of the challenges coming out through the European Commission in Brussels. I'm sure you know that tobacco legislation will be opened in most of the EU member states because of a delegated act, due to the fact that heated tobacco has grown sufficiently enough for them to ban flavors. And I can only guess what will happen with EU legislation in member states when it's open. And I think maybe the strategy of the European Commission here is that they would like to see more negative regulation for harm reduction products in the member states during the time when legislation is open, because then they have to harmonize. So we are in a pre-harmonization situation in the European Union, and I think we all have to figure out how we can push harm reduction from a member state's perspective. Yeah, anything you want to know about the EU process, I can help with. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Konstantinos.
I think that we should also use the example of snus as a perfect example of the corruption of the authorities in the European Union. In 2019, snus was authorized by the FDA with a claim of reduced risk, not just exposure to toxins, but reduced risk for several diseases: oral cancer, heart disease, lung disease, COPD. And in Europe, it is banned. The only product in tobacco harm reduction with such a high quality level of evidence from epidemiology, not from laboratory studies, not from animal studies, not from modeling, from true science, hardcore clinical data. And in Europe, this product is banned. This shows the level of ethical corruption of the authorities, because it's an ethics corruption when a lawyer says in the European court that Swedish men have low rates of smoking because they take paternity leave. This is corruption. This is nonsense. But he had the courage to say that loudly and publicly, and I suppose he's maintaining his position. She, okay. So, yeah. And she's Swedish. I didn't know that. That shows you who we are dealing with. And I think that the Michael Russell oration that I gave this year, I had the privilege to be invited to give you the lecture. It showed exactly that. It was about that. It was about the authoritarian mentality of the tobacco control movement industry and the authorities who are using the tobacco control industry in order to implement more and more rules, which are always more and more restrictive for the lowest harm products, even for the products with a proven record that another organization on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean has provided after many years of delays, of course, but finally, an authorization with reduced risk claims. And no one is discussing about this discrepancy between Europe and the US. At least in that would have been a starting point. Not that in the US everything is perfect. I mean, look at what's happening with the cigarette research. It's basically very hard to trust any kind of research coming from the US concerning electronic cigarettes. It's that crazy. When you see the health organizations there calling a disease caused by illicit marijuana products as e-cigarette or vaping-associated lung injury, so that they made sure that if someone doesn't understand the term e-cigarette, we will add vaping so that we will make sure that they are convinced it's because of electronic cigarettes. And they never even made a single attempt to change the terminology when they themselves admitted that it was because of illicit marijuana products. When I've seen, because I've been a reviewer, I've been an editor for journals, and I've seen people who, scientists, who were not willing to mention things by their names. I had a paper presenting data from marijuana products, and they were discussing about vaping products, and they did not want to mention the term marijuana product. And I had to start a fight with the chief editor of the journal and the authors in order to mention what they were reporting. Just mention the name of what you were studying. It's unbelievable. This is what is happening in science. This is what is happening in politics. This is what is happening in public health. And I think that the last 2 years of the COVID pandemic showed that this is overall corruption, you know, ethical corruption.
Sorry, Cecilia, did you want to?
No, and I think it's, if you read the endless commission papers, it's very clear where they want to go. And their goal now is a smoke-free Europe 2040, or a tobacco-free Europe. But obviously the risk and everything we see from the regulatory papers is that they're going to equate reduced risk products with smoking. And then they're on their way of destroying this category. I don't think necessarily they will win, but I think we also need to... There is a big fight in front of us. And Europe is a successful political project. They are also exporting regulation, and we see how they maneuver around the WHO. And that is why it's even more important that we really manage to push harm reduction in this coming legislation.
Can I just, and I think we've heard sort of some very good examples or outlines of what the blockages and the challenges are, you know, and there's political, there's bureaucratic, there's institutional. So the $64,000 question is, what can we best to tackle that? Is it what you were saying, Konstantinos? Is it improving the level of understanding and knowledge with the public? And if so, how do we do that? Or does it need more than that?
They will never vote on the next directive because that's not usually how they do it, but they will sort of feel the atmosphere in the room. And in order to get a blocking minority, if I remember correctly, you need 4 countries with at least 35% of the population. And if the Commission is they're very smart people, and they will not push countries into, they want to have an agreement. So I think we need to, some countries are lost, the Netherlands, Finland, Spain, I think, but there are other countries where there is an acceptance of harm reduction. And we need to be smart about it, and we need to, and I think that's another important point, we need unity. There are some companies, colleagues of ours, that are throwing some certain reduced risk products under the bus because they don't have skin in the game. There is there are quite a number of interests who are just defending what's important to them, and if we can't be unified for all the reduced risk categories, we're going to lose in the end. One example, for example, is the flavor restrictions on vaping, which we don't really care about because we don't have it. But it's going to impact what's going to happen on pouches. So it would be stupid for us not to care about it. And I guess you've seen, but the Swedish Parliament is most likely going to vote against a flavor ban on vaping products, which is a first in Europe. So that's positive. But we have to protect the harm reduction, not only category by category.
And on harm reduction in the broader context, it's very depressing to hear Netherlands being in that camp when in the UK we've often looked to the Netherlands for developments around drug harm reduction. It's a bit like Australia,
It's
really.
a bit of a hypocrisy, you know. But I think we need to differentiate what the industry is doing, because there are other types of vested interests in the industry too. And of course, in many cases, they have a common interest with the public, and what the consumer is doing. And let's not forget the experience from 2013 and 2014, the first TPD, where the consumers played a very important role in applying pressure to the authorities, to the European Commission. In this instance, we've lost the biggest consumer market in Europe, which is the UK. So we've lost the power and the influence of the authorities there, which were at that time probably the only ones who had endorsed these products to a large extent, and then even more later. And that's going to be a big problem for the EU. But I think that we need to mobilize consumers, and consumer power is undisputed, and it's not influenced by any conflicts. That's also very important. And so they cannot use any justification to ignore the consumer's opinion. So, but I think that they will be prepared for that because they have the experience from 2013, 2014. Still, I think the consumer plays a huge role, and they should be mobilized themselves independently of what the industry or even the scientific community is doing. They have to use their own arguments, and they have to exercise their own right to have products available that will protect themselves. So the Vapers Association should become organized. Consumer organizations like INCO, they should be more and better organized. I don't know, they must be a bit creative, finding ways to apply pressure to the EU. I remember at that time there were vapers coming to outside the European Parliament with black balloons and so on, and exercising their right to have these products available. It worked at that time. They'll be prepared for that too now, but still we need to act in a more aggressive way. And I say we because I'm also a consumer, and I'm also a smoker who failed to quit with everything, and I had tried everything. Of course, I was successful with everything, but for a few months. And it was with an e-cigarette that I managed to quit and stay off tobacco cigarettes for 10 years now, more than 10 years. So, you know, they can discuss about whatever science or science in quotes they think, but they cannot deny reality. And the reality are the millions of people who have managed to quit smoking with electronic cigarettes. And this is a fact. Nothing can change that.
Has anyone got any good, and I will come back
I
to
just wanted to add something to what Cecile said, because recently also the Czech Republic has jumped on the wagon of standing for tobacco harm reduction, which is also very good. But also, for instance, right now we had the call for evidence, and which, organizations and consumer organizations took part. But also, I think it was important for consumers individually to also tell their story, because what's more evidence than how this has helped you give up smoking? And regarding flavors, I was still a little bit, I had some hope in that they, maybe from the European Commission, they were kind of going to recommend banning flavors in the various member states. But right now, I think that the prohibition might come directly from the European Commission. But I don't know if France would be too happy with that, because, of course, as Constantino says, we've missed, we don't have the UK anymore. So, but anyway, and then
we need a substitute for the UK. And France is
well,
I think,
hope
a candidate.
Yeah, and I hope we can also have some hope in Greek, too, soon. But anyway, yeah.
that leads in the point about the Czech Republic changing their position. I mean, it does feel to me, and this is probably, the fact I was a civil servant when I had a proper job, a bureaucrat, but, this is, to me, a lot of it's a political problem, and it's very hard. I know lots of people have tried to engage politicians, but I've been involved in other things where you plug away for years and years, but then something happens and you can go, and you do get that political buy-in that allows things to happen. And there's a little bit in the UK, I think, the 2030 target has actually helped because people are going, that's not very far away now, and anything that helps us do it. And so, okay, and I think we've probably got a critical mass. Things are not perfect in the UK at all, as many people in this audience will testify. But it would be almost impossible to row back very far.
But I think Martin made that comment yesterday. It's not a harm reduction country, it's a vaping country. And you would think that they would look at the evidence you have on snus, which is in abundance, but no, because they don't want a new tobacco product on the market. So I think when it comes to politicians, I think the tobacco policy is sort of quite straightforward, and it's been outsourced to civil servants. They're extremely well organized. So, and going back to the European Parliament, if it wouldn't have been for the consumers that actually got the members of the European Parliament engaged in the issue, we would have had a de facto ban on vaping in the EU today. So it's public choice. You need to find the politicians that feel that they have a pressure from their voters. But without that, the civil servants are just going to ram it through.
No, you're right to correct me, because actually, politically, on drugs or anything, harm reduction has never been a popular phrase in the UK. We can put things under the category of harm reduction, but it's never something you see in a political manifesto. Rarely gets mentioned by politicians in speeches. But there must be something we can do, or at least we have to keep plugging away at the different politicians who are in a position to make a difference. But how do we do it better?
I think MEPs are misinformed. Well, that for sure. Not all of them are informed. Just keep in mind, for the revision of the TPD2, the SKIR report.
Oh, yeah.
I know, I mean, I'm not a scientist. He can speak better about it, but it was terrible.
They didn't know that snus existed as evidence on long-term nicotine use, and they were using, animal studies, cell studies to present the risks that don't exist with snus, while we know that snus users obtain the same or even higher levels of nicotine than a smoker. So, and that's a very common misperception among scientists who are not really involved in this arena and are doing it, let's do something with nicotine and that's it. I remember a few years ago I was in an American Heart Association conference, and they were presenting some studies from the 90s and the 2000s about mice with their aortas exposed and showing the atherosclerotic lesions from nicotine. And I was a member of the panel, and I asked them, why don't we see with long-term cohort studies with snus, why don't we see an increased risk in myocardial infarction? And it's not just one study. There are studies for myocardial infarction, repeated studies. There are studies with stroke, again, the same story. And they said they acknowledged the discrepancy. And then I asked them, and it was a rhetorical question. I asked them, do you think we should trust the mice and the laboratory cells, or the data we have from human epidemiological studies? And, no one answered, because they realized that that was a question that didn't need to be answered. But that shows you the approach. I was never invited again, of course, because they don't like being embarrassed through a question, especially when an FDA representative was also there at that time, next to me. So, it ends up being a one-sided debate, basically not a debate, We're just saying, you're great, you're saying everything excellent, you're excellent, because we have the same opinion. Unfortunately, the same is happening here, but the difference is that here at GFN, we have tried repeatedly, and I know, Jay, at some point when I was also an advisor for the program, We have tried repeatedly, and they have tried repeatedly to bring people who have different opinions here and present whatever they want for as much time as they want to. They never even responded to such invitations. So it's not us who avoid the debate, the dialogue. It's them. And there is a reason why it's them and not us.
Cecilia.
Yeah, no, I just, the Skinny report was horrible, but there was some nuggets in there which they, of course, misrepresented in the executive summary, and no one reads the reports, or very few people read the report, but they read the executive summary, and I think we have an equally bad example with the Scheer report on vaping, and I remember reading the Public Health England latest evidence report, and they said we can't use this because it's just crap. But it doesn't matter, because this is the foundation for future legislation.
Do we need something like nicotine for dummies? It's a really simple, nicotine for politicians who may also be dummies, I guess, but do we need something really basic as a sort of basic tool that we can get to various politicians? Yes, I think we should. The problem with the timeline of the directive is, of course, that it's coming out, if according to plan, early 2024, and that's after the next election to the European Parliament, so you don't know who is still there, or if you have a lot of new people. But of course, I think with vaping last time around, it became obvious for the MEPs that this is just strange and weird. So that has, of course, to be repeated again with that, providing that information. Because if you present the arguments, they're logical. We are right. It's obvious that we're right. It's just that at the moment they might not be interested. They are only interested in what's on the agenda today. But if you know MEPs, if you have contact with them, it's never wrong to provide information. Okay, I think we should come out to the audience with particularly acceptance of accepting compliments about the conference, but we also want to hear specific points, your highlights. So who would like to say something, any particular issues that people would like to raise reflecting on the last few days? Gentleman here.
Thank you, Rafi Castillo from Manila, Philippines. So again, going back to the question, is THR here to stay? Definitely, I believe it's here to stay. But if we want THR to really advance forward and not to linger somehow in limbo, I think we need to realize that it has gone, the issue, the debates, the discussions have actually gone beyond the academic or scientific realm. And I believe it's now more in the legal realm, and that's, I think, where we need to build ourselves up. I'm a relatively newcomer in this field. I must, as I admitted, more than 2 years ago, I was more towards, I and my group were leaning towards tobacco harm reduction. But, you know, we had to contend with reality, with real-world issues, and we believe that THR is a more pragmatic solution if we want to get rid of the smoking problem. But as soon as we made that realization, we also discovered that there's really a whole set of barriers which are impeding us. And initially, we thought that producing more data would be one major answer, but we realized it's a lot more complicated than that. We tried to produce several papers. We were able to complete 3 papers. Of the 3 papers, we tried to get it published, but only one got published, and we got all sorts of comments from peer reviewers, from editors about the 2 papers. Yeah, it's really difficult to get our papers published. So I think again, it's not anymore confined to the scientific realm. I believe we have reached the threshold of evidence for THR, but I think it's more on the it's now the fight is now more on the legal side, as pointed out. I think we need more lawyers here in this movement, which can actually protect the rights of smokers who want to try vaping. For example, the mandate now being proposed in Spain, I believe it's something that is contradictory to the international Bill of Rights. You know, it may not be within the Bill of Rights, but it's akin to that. The right to free market is, I think, enshrined in most constitutions. So we need to build up our arguments at this level. So not only in the scientific realm, but more on the legal aspect. So just an impression, an observation which I have, which I think we may have to consider. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'm sure the panel all agree that, you know, we are convinced there's enough data. It's top secret, so I shouldn't share it, but in the GFN laboratories, they're actually working to clone David Sweena, which would address a particular point. So we're hoping to have a production line rolling off David Sweena's very shortly. Are there any other questions or points that people would like to make? Oh.
I'm Bengt Wiberg, founder of EU for Snus movement. I have a question for Cecilia. I mentioned earlier the European Tobacco Harm Reduction Advocates made a survey, the biggest nicotine user survey ever performed. 39,000 responses, 35,000 nicotine users in EU countries. And there were massive evidence of, for example, when it comes to those 6,000, if I remember correctly, who were smokers, sole smokers, 30% of those were 60% of the smokers wanted to stop smoking, and 30% of those would like to try snus if it was available. So my question to you, Cecilia, having a more in-depth sight of the work going on in the European Union, has this survey results, 35,000 respondents, has this been ever discussed among the politicians in Brussels?
Not that I'm aware of, and I would guess not. I think it was brought up earlier today that in the last panel that the consumers are stating what they want, but it doesn't really register with the policymakers. The view of the policymakers is that people should just quit with tobacco and nicotine. That's it. There is this smoke-free goal 2040, less than 5%, and that's the decided goal. That being said, the last time around, TPD2, the consumers, not the industry, it was the consumers that made the impression. It was the consumers that changed the trajectory for vaping. And I just hope that there are more of you and that you have more energy next time around, because it's going to be needed.
Yeah, fully agree, as I said, but I want to answer to the suggestion that we should engage more lawyers. Well, in Europe, there was a case in the European Court for snus, and you don't need any more level of evidence than what you already have for snus. It's been used traditionally for decades in Sweden, in Scandinavia, and not only in Scandinavia, but the most important thing was that all of the studies on snus were not coming from the industry. It was basically all the epidemiological studies, 0% of them were coming from the industry. So they had a very, very strong legal case. They lost. It's that simple.
We actually, it was the second time we took that case.
Yeah.
We lost both times.
Yeah, and don't forget what happened just before TPD1, the current TPD, I think the current TPD is TPD2. What happened just before TPD2 during the negotiation process, with that the Director General of Health from Malta. I don't remember the name. Can you remind us the name?
John Daly.
Yeah. For those who are not from the EU and don't remember, I think it was Swedish Match which said that that he asked for a few million euros.
60.
Yeah, in order to add snus as an acceptable product for the European Union. And, he was just removed from his position. We never heard anything about any inquiry on whether that was right or wrong. But I think that a few months later, he was caught with 10 million euros in financial heaven somewhere in Cayman Islands, I don't remember when. But there was never a single inquiry in the EU on whether that was valid or not, on whether there was something wrong, doing something illegal or whatever. He was just silently left the position. Someone else came back, and of course, snus was banned once again through the TPD2. So legally, I agree with you that we need also lawyers, but no, it's not enough. Even when the case is as obvious as it can get. You can't get anything better than snus. No other product has anything even close to snus. Still, even the FDA, which finally authorized the lower risk, it happened in 2019.
Just to clarify, we reported something that we found very extraordinarily strange. And then there was an inquiry by this anti-corruption agency, Olaf.
Which found what?
They found that there was unambiguous circumstantial evidence. I think the term
Nothing.
was
Okay,
nothing.
thanks.
But just going to the FDA, which is also interesting, I'm puzzled by the claim, because we can communicate the claim on our products, but we still have to keep the warning labels, causes cancer. So I don't think that it's the most effective claim ever.
I agree, but but there is a huge discrepancy between banning the sales of the product in a whole region where tobacco cigarette sales are perfectly legal, and on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, you have a country and an organization, a health organization, which at least allowed a reduced risk claim with all the problems of that decision, which I fully agree, because risk aversion is the new ethical standard of politicians. They want zero risk, so they basically advocate for inaction, which means don't even look at harm reduction, which means that we keep the status quo of the highest risk product, which is the tobacco cigarette. So in reality, the inaction in a risk aversion strategy produces much more risk than action, which may include accepting a pretty minimal, in some cases not even existent, level of risk. So it's a hypocrisy by definition. It's the exact definition of hypocrisy.
Yeah, it's like it's black or white. Quit as we want you to quit, or die.
Yeah. And in reality, they are supposed to support the white, but it's a Trojan horse for the black, for tobacco cigarettes. All they're doing is protect tobacco cigarettes from having any competition.
Yes.
Even what you mentioned in Spain, these products should be sold only by tobacconists, who of course would prefer to sell the products that they traditionally sell, and would have no motivation or incentive to sell a THR product, especially a product which is not even a tobacco product like the electronic cigarette, right?
But Angelos, you said something then.
Yes.
And it was a point that was really made very strongly, I think, in Mark Tyndall's presentation today.
A bit louder, please.
I'll hold this closer to my mouth, that will probably do. There was the point about quit or die, and it was an issue that was raised in Mark Tyndall's presentation. How is it we've got to this situation where there is such a lack of empathy for people who are going to die or be seriously ill? I can't think of another category of You know, there's lots of things people don't get treated as well as they might, but there's nothing quite like smokers. What could we do about that? Because I don't really know quite how it's come about, given that so many people who have got those attitudes, you know, their parents, their grandparents, they must have known people who smoked, who, you know, what do we do? How do we address that empathy deficit?
It is very complicated because at least in Spain, I mean, it's super that people can continue smoking. I mean, they don't really care. I mean, they just still increase revenue, and people in tobacco control maintain their jobs, which is pretty good. But how to convince them that white is also there?
Well, I think that what you're mentioning is a typical example of how the tobacco control movement has been very successful in misinforming citizens. Because, and I mentioned during my lecture that in 2017, when we did a population representative study survey in Greece, less than 5% of smokers believed that electronic cigarettes are significantly less harmful than smoking. And more than 40% believe that they are equally or more harmful than smoking. Well, they've been successful, I mean, based on what they wanted to do is create aversion for these products in the population. They've been successful, unfortunately, even among smokers. And that's the problem. How we are going to communicate proper, reliable information when we are competing with a giant who has all the money, all the power, the political power, and the political will to follow the tobacco control, you know, scenario.
I think the main argument they're using is we have to protect the children without any consideration of the parents or grandparents of the children. And I don't know if there is any credible study on gateway from reduced risk products to smoking. I haven't seen anyone, but I think the gateway is still, that's an area we really need to create a narrative around. The other thing is, I think it might be that some in tobacco control have a challenge to understand the difference between hazard and risk. I once tried to talk with an official in the European Commission about the difference, and he said, I don't know what this is all about. And I think that might be the sort of underlying problem with this debate, that they're not that knowledgeable, but they have a mission, and they are effective civil servants, and they're supposed to do what they're supposed to do.
I'm very conscious of the time. Is there anyone out in the audience, any last minute comments, thoughts? That anyone, gentleman here?
Yes, just Claude Bamberger from France. And yes, there is a study about the gateway, or more exactly the non-gateway effect of vaping to smoking in France, with 40% reduction in smoking rate, daily smoking rate in later teens if they vape before, between 15 and 17. And this has been published twice. It's from the same source, which is a very large study. And it was published with two angles. I've got a small question. I've seen as a vapor some of what you describe in the academic publication with surprising low level, because I'm not an academic and I can find huge failures in the publication that should be just authorized in a exercise at school, and that are published in papers that are taken into account by people like Scare Report. The thing is, when look at some other subjects, because I'm still a citizen, I also see these patterns in other fields, like considering natural gas is very green to avoid CO2 emissions. Don't you think that convincing millions of ex-smokers that globally the political system and the scientists or official authorities don't care, convincing millions that people concerned about environment, that the politics don't care, on the part of the scientific authorities don't care, is very careful. Careful for the future of elections?
Yeah, I think, well, thank you for the point on gateway theory there, and those of us from a drugs field background spent years struggling with people who were convinced by gateway theories, and then we found there wasn't a gate. And I think that point about caring, and it's very difficult to get people to take on board information if they don't care, is a very valid one. I'm now going to be really unfair to the panel and ask you to each come up one take-home point or action you would like to see people do, or a presentation that you'd particularly like to highlight from this year's GFN.
For instance, something that I could, like last message, right? Totally free? Well, what I really would like is especially institutions to stop lying, governments to stop lying, stop stigma, and of course don't demonize nicotine. Nicotine is not that bad.
I agree. Nicotine is not that bad, but it is the new black when it comes to a regulatory approach. I think this was an excellent conference, reinforcing maybe my own biases on what I know about reduced risk products, but also underlining the fact that I think we have history on our side, and we might be sliding sometimes when it comes to truth, but we're not lying like they are.
I'll try to avoid making wishes which can never become a reality by themselves. So I fully agree with everything both my colleagues here mentioned, but we need to fight for that. And the fight is tremendous, and it's not only science, it's politics, it's mentality, it is political philosophy, it's our approach to what society is. It's much, much more than pure data analysis from studies in labs or in the population or in a clinic or in cells in animals or whatever else. It's much more complicated than that. We need to approach it from the perspective of political philosophy and what we want society to be and what's the role of the individual in a society. Should we respect individuals, or should we use individuals as servants of society? This is the question, and we know the answer to this question by the tobacco control movement. I think the whole political movement globally is moving to a direction that individuals don't like it, and that's why I chose to avoid presenting any data in the Michael Russell oration this year, and I preferred to approach it from a sociological and philosophical perspective. So it's a very strong fight. Everyone has a role to play. The industry with their own vested interests, the consumers, the scientists, every citizen as a political subject, because, you know, not only professional politicians are politicians. Every citizen, every active citizen is also a politician.
Thank you very much. Well, I took from that, we've got to fight stigma, got truth on our side, individuals matter, and history is also on our side. That sounds like a very, very good way to end the sort of, if you will, formal part of GFN 2022. So please join me in thanking Angeles, Cecilia and Konstantinos. Very well done to all of you for maintaining your stamina. And I now need to ask Charles Gardner to come up to the stage. Charles, the time is now. This isn't in the programme. Do not panic.
Where shall I?
Yeah, all yours.
All right, this has been a fantastic meeting. I'm Charles Gardner. I'm the executive director of INCO, and INCO has the honor of presenting an award. We give out awards every year, but we've never given this award before. This is an award for extraordinary achievement in tobacco harm reduction, and I am delighted to give this award to Jerry Stimson, Professor Jerry Stimson. Jerry nursed us in our cradle and carried us on his shoulders for a long time. And we are beyond being toddlers now. We're ready to play rugby. Thank you so much, Jerry.
Well, for once, I'm truly lost for words. That's really wonderful. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, INCO. And thank you, everybody else who comes here and works in tobacco harm reduction and makes it all possible. Thank you.